Welcome everybody to this session. My name is Keith Pentz. I am a early years program consultant. I come to you from Sarasota, Florida. I was talking with Jerry earlier. It's about 70, now about 73 and sunny here today, which for us is just a sort of typical January. So that's sort of nice. I was born and I grew up north. So I'm used to colder weather too, and I spent some time out in Utah and all kinds of weather as well. My background is primarily the classroom. I have 18 years experience as a classroom teacher directly. Part of that time was teaching preschool. I've worked with infants and toddlers as well as kindergarten and lower elementary. I've also been a college professor, assistant professor of early childhood education at the University of Central Florida, and also another college up in the Boston area. Following that, I worked for several years with Kaplan Early Learning Company, doing professional development and training and so on for Kaplan. And then a couple of years ago, I went ahead and branched out on my own and have my own consulting business at this point in time. The topic for today, for this afternoon, is making the body-brain-mind connection in teaching and learning. This has been an interesting piece that I have been exploring for many years, actually. And I first started attending brain research workshops back in the late 1980s, probably before some of you were even born, which is okay. And then, especially into the 90s and the 2000s, doing a lot of that work. In addition, in the last 10 years, I've been spending a lot of time looking at mental health, which is somewhat the mind, and I will differentiate between all of these things. Mental health as it relates to well-being, as well as learning and processing information. And of course, our bodies are a significant part. And so you will notice that I am using those three different words: body, brain, and mind. Our bodies are our physical, the sort of the outward and somewhat inward parts of us. It's that physical nature that we have. Our brains are our gray matter and our nervous system. And so that is the physical piece of us that would be identifiable if we cut open our heads and so on, and we looked inside, we'd see that. Our mind, however, many times the brain and the mind seem to be interspersed, at least historically, that's been true. But in about the last 15 or so years, we've the work of Dan Siegel, Alan Shore, and some other people, especially out at UCLA, have talked about the mind as being part of what they refer to as interpersonal neurobiology. In other words, the mind is really getting at a sense of who we are as individuals. It has a lot to do with our sense of consciousness, our likes, our dislikes, all of that. And so that influences us. That influences us. So if we take a look at body, brain, mind, those three words in that sequence, and we reverse it, our minds are actually those things that we come to like and enjoy and that sort of thing. That impacts our brain. So we go back a step. That impacts our brain because that's going to impact the things and how we're going to allow things to wire, whether or not we want things to wire positively or whether we want to reject it. And then, of course, that in turn influences our body, because we know that our bodies, our wellness, so to speak, can be influenced big time by circumstances and other considerations with life choices and that sort of thing. So today, as I'm talking about making the body, brain, mind connection, it's like all three of these things are tightly interwoven, and we need to understand that, especially as we're thinking about teaching and learning. And so as I start, I want to talk specifically about all this, but in a framework of how do we go about it in a classroom. And so I was sent the link for the Utah State preschool standards. And it was interesting that when I opened that up and started to read, one of the first words that popped up in that list of things that was important, actually it was the first word in the list of how to begin things, was the concept of play. And knowing that I was already going to be talking about this, I thought, oh, this is really, really cool stuff. And in addition to that, it listed a couple of these other things that I already have on this slide. You know, what is the role of play in learning? Now, typically we think of play as being some random thing, and many of us, you know, grew up, you know, with just this idea of a free-for-all in many cases. But if we think about play, and I'm going to be talking about some things today that will hopefully make you understand play a little differently. If we think about play as a learning and teaching strategy, we need to think about play. A colleague of mine talks about it as scaffolding or scaffolded play, borrowing from Vygotsky and Jerome Bruner's concept of how we scaffold learning. Well, we can scaffold learning through play as well. And so we think of it as inspiring curiosity, inspiring creativity. We're very imaginative. We gain excitement. There's a feeling of accomplishment whenever we are playing and successful at something. Play also offers a sense of wonder and delight and awe. And so the role of play in learning, as you can see, is a very, very positive one. And you'll come to understand why that is so critical in just a moment. In addition to that, play is also the foundation for cognitive development. Now, we need to understand what cognition is. Cognition is about not just knowledge, but about understanding. It's about understanding. So it's being able to understand information. Play gives us that opportunity. If you think about, you know, if you're forced to learn something and you memorize it in a non-playful manner, it sort of goes in and leaves after a while. You know, if you think back to maybe your own schooling situation, you know, if there was subject matter that you didn't particularly care for, you learned enough to pass a test, pass a grade, that sort of thing, but you probably haven't thought about some of those things ever since. And so that isn't what we would refer to as cognitive development per se, because it really isn't about understanding. But if there was something that you were really excited about and that you got to engage with in a very hands-on, fun, playful manner, that has stuck with you. And you probably have come back to review it many times. And so it has become a part of you, so to speak. So your understanding of that is very significant. I mentioned Vygotsky earlier, the Russian psychologist. One of the things that Vygotsky said in his research was that when we are in play mode, we actually are functioning at what he referred to as a head taller, meaning that developmentally, when we are, quote unquote, in a play mindset, we are able to do things developmentally beyond our years. That's why it's so critical that we make sure that children are in a positive, playful environment and that they are experiencing things with their understanding of what play is. Remember, what is play for one person may not necessarily be play for somebody else. I'll give you a very quick example out of my own background. I'm also 3 boys. I was very much into music, into books, into academics, and that sort of thing. While all 3 of us did well academically, we excelled in sort of different areas. My middle brother was very mechanical in his enjoyment of things. He could take things apart and put them back together, and just was very, very mechanical. I wasn't blessed with that skill. I don't have that skill. Kip also, attempted music, but was not near as successful as I was. My younger brother was very, very sports minded. He excelled at football and track and so on. And while Kip and I played, Carl was the one who actually was very, very talented. And so play, or what we enjoy and like, is different for different people. And so each child is also going to do that. That's why in your classrooms, it's important to make sure that you provide a multitude of experiences for children, so that children can pick up on what is significant for each of them. And you'll understand more about that also in a moment. I have uploaded into a file for this particular session a handout, and this is one of the pages of the handout. So if you go to that file, you will find a couple pages of handouts, and this is one of them. It's something that I use in a lot of my presentations. It's an acronym. It talks about the learning process and how the learning process works. So we think about body, brain, mind. It's all in this as well. This comes from the work of Bob Sylvester, who's a professor emeritus in the University of Oregon. And you'll see the acronym at the top is SEAL, or SEAL, sort of seal the deal, so to speak. The S refers to a stimulus. A stimulus is any sensory provocation. That is what starts learning. So if we think of the body as being a sensory receptor, in other words, something we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, those are the 5 external senses. We also have internal senses, which are still part of our body, but our internal senses are vestibular sense, which is our sense of balance, it's our inner ear, and our proprioceptive sense. Our proprioceptive sense is our sense of understanding where our bodies are, how our body parts are functioning, where those body parts are in space, and that sort of thing. So if we think of the 7 senses, or those 7 I mentioned, as being the start or the beginning for learning, that's the body connection. Then we have the brain connection. That sensory data is being transmitted into our brains. It's coming up into our brains. And based on our prior experience or our prior understanding, which is now our mind, we are going to have emotional responses. So the stimulus is driving an emotion. That's the E in this acronym. That emotion is going to be positive or negative. If it's a positive emotion, if we have a positive response to the stimulus, that positive emotion is going to drive what we refer to as executive functions. Now, we know executive functions, that's been a buzzword for the last 20, 25 years. But executive functions have to do with basic knowledge acquisition, have to do with understanding, once again, have to do with self-control, higher order thought processing, self-regulation, empathy. All of those are executive functions. And so when stimuli come in, they're driving our emotional responses. And if we have that positive emotional response to that stimuli, it's going to drive those executive functions. That's what we want to have happen. That's that brain firing and wiring and that cognitive development that we saw earlier actually taking place. And ultimately we learn what's going on. But note, there's a secondary pattern here. If a stimulus comes in, meaning something we see, hear, taste, touch, or smell, or we are not permitted to move, or we're confused about where our bodies are and how our body parts are working and so on, that is going to drive a negative emotion. And once again, that negative emotion is often related to prior experiences, meaning our mind. And as a result of that, those negative emotions drive what we refer to as survival. And so it's the difference between executive functions, meaning the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and negative emotions, which have to do with survival, which is our brain stem. In the literature, we read about this as fight, flight, and freeze. And so if we don't like something, we're going to resist it. There's going to be that fighting or that fleeing from it, or in some cases, just a freeze. In other words, we don't want to deal with it. Children are going to do that. And so the learning in that particular case is, hey, this isn't something I want to deal with. And so therefore I don't want to learn anything. So if we think about making the body, brain, mind connection, we need to think about how are we going to do that and establish it as a strategy for playful events. How are we going to be intentional about that? So I like to think of it as what I refer to as explorations. Explorations as playful events. Too many times when we think about our standards or our goals or our objectives, we don't think of them as being open-ended. We think of them as being somewhat closed and that we have limited opportunity to expand on them. I'd like to challenge you, if not encourage you, to think about the ways that you offer information to children. Remember, you're working with preschool age children. These are children who don't have much of a past. And depending on what they experienced in their past, they may not have a strong foundation. Remember, Vygotsky told us, you got to start with the foundation. You got to start with that base and you got to scaffold up on it. You got to build on that to the next level of understanding. And so explorations provide that opportunity. They give us an opportunity to talk about or to share information that is going to build on something. So I chose this illustration here of this young child, probably about a 2-year-old, playing. And take a look. This is an opportunity. If we look at an exploration, the child is engaged. The child is aware. The child is using multiple senses in this particular environment. This is an opportunity to teach, but the teaching is not done through a series of questions. In other words, it's best not to ask the child, what color is the big truck? What color is the little truck? What color is the truck to your side? What color is the locomotive beside you? What does the ground feel like? Those are questions. Now, I'm not saying we should not ask questions of children. It's just that if we're looking at questions as being some sort of an assessment or a method to figure out what children know, it's much better to reverse that out and have the child tell us or describe what they're seeing. And you could say, tell me about the trucks that you're playing with. And then if they start naming the color, then we know that. And then, or it's best if we just actually describe it for the child. Oh, I see you have a big yellow truck and the dumper is holding a small yellow truck. Look at those wheels. They look like circles. And so we're providing information for the child in a playful situation where they are functioning at a head taller, and we're giving them that information, and it's a free exploration. It's fun, it's exciting, and so the brain is taking in that information rather than asking things that the child may or may not have experienced or may not know. In about the last 12 or 15 years, we have been bombarded with STEM and STEAM learning. I want to address this a little bit. The pandemic has sort of stifled a little bit of that stuff going on, but it's still present. It's still there. We still hear about it. And I anticipate that once we get back into a more typical type of situation in classrooms, we're probably going to reemerge with still focusing on some STEM and STEAM. I think that in addition to that, though, that we're probably going to need to go back to a healthy dose of social and emotional. And while that has been an ongoing piece as well, I think it's going to be even more critical as we come back. But let's stay with STEM and STEAM for right now. And hopefully it'll make some more body, brain, and mind connections for you as I go through these. The S in STEM or STEAM refers to science. The best science is always taught outside. I don't care who you are, what you're doing, the best science is outside. There's physical science, there's biological science, there's life science, there's just all science is out there. So I use this image of this little guy, taking a pair of binoculars and taking a look at the world. For a child, everything is outside. Everything outside is such an opportunity. And you live in a climate where you have, some seasonal changes that are probably more significant than where I am right now in Florida. So you get to see differences and looking at life cycle changes and that sort of thing. There are just so many things that can happen. And so when you provide opportunities for children to explore the outside in a playful manner, and we'll find out more about that in a little bit, but that idea of discovery and just exploration, once again, there's that word too, exploration as a playful event, the knowledge and learning, talking about what the child is observing, what the child is experiencing, is laying down vocabulary as well as conceptual ideas for the child. And so science starts the STEM and STEAM process. Or I should say it's one of the foundational words, and it starts to build. The T in STEM or STEAM refers to technology. Now I'm going to probably challenge your thinking a little bit. What we are using today for me to broadcast to you is actually electronic media. We're using Zoom, I'm using a camera, a computer, other things. That's electronic media. That is actually a subset of technology. Unfortunately, technology, the word itself, has sort of been misused. I'll use that kindly. It's become relegated to all the electronic stuff, which is really electronic media. Technology, by definition, if you look up technology and you get a definition for technology, what you will find is that technology is defined as anything created by humans. Anything created by humans. And so the images that I put up on the screen here for technology are our basic early childhood technology tools. Paints, crayons, pencils, scissors, paper, glue. All of those are basic technology tools. The electronic media that we use in turn, screens and so on, are supplemental. They're in addition to. And so we need to understand that technology is broader than just electronic media, and that when we incorporate the use of these more hands-on pieces, which we'll talk more about in a bit too, it actually brings in information in a different way, and it solidifies information. E is for engineering. Engineering is about problem solving, coming up with solutions to things. It's about building, putting things together, all of that. I use this image of some blocks. You'll hear me talk about blocks more here in just a bit. Blocks to me are sort of that foundational tool that we have in our classrooms, and we should be using blocks in as many possible ways as we possibly can. So everyday engineering is about building, putting things together and so on. So anytime children are in the block area, they're actually doing engineering. So you never have to worry about, am I meeting a goal or a standard? If you think about, when I'm using these materials, I'm also meeting them under different categories. So if you have a STEM STEAM agenda that you're supposed to be adhering to, as I'm sharing with you, you can be incorporating these pieces and these materials into that as well. The A that is in STEAM, it's not, obviously not in STEM, but the A refers to the arts. Arts are about imagination, creativity. That word pops up again here. We began with the idea of play. Notice the image I put up here too. It's a child playing with blocks. Once again, there's an artistic feel to the blocks in this particular case. Visual arts, we can, in this sense, look at the color, the shape, the form, the functionality, the design. You know, it's all those things that we think about when we think about art, visual art in particular, and the child is able to incorporate all that into the use of the blocks that the child is playing with. So once again, art is a very important piece in this whole thing. That's why I'm much more of a STEAM person than I am necessarily just a STEM person. Math is all around the math, the M for math is what we have in STEM or STEAM. Excuse me. Math is all around. It could be the blocks, it could be the numbers that are represented on those blocks in this particular case. It could also be looking at higher order pieces related to math, or I should say, a more advanced type of math called geometry. We can refer to the blocks as actually cubes, which is the geometrical name for a solid geometrical shape. So we can talk about what the faces of the blocks represent, square-like shapes, and we talk about the entire block, which is the cubicle. So in other words, math is all around us in its various parts. If you take a look on the image too, you'll see a hand. The hand represents their digits there, the 3 fingers that are up. But you could also do it for counting. How many knuckles do you see? How many lines do you see on the fingers? You know, are the lines parallel? Here we get back into geometry and that sort of thing. Take a look at the other image. We have, see the baby pigs. The piglets, we can count the number of eyes, you know, ears, body parts, and all that sort of thing. We can do comparisons, you know, larger, smaller, color shape variations and so on. So we start incorporating a lot of math as well as science and other things there. And then the building itself, we can talk about the shape of the windows, you know, looking at parallel lines that help in the construction and so on. So math is all around. And once again, it's like I had that other illustration with the young child playing with the trucks. You know, if we are discussing this as we're looking at it, we're actually instructing children on these things. So taking a look at your standards and goals, what are your things that you're supposed to be teaching? Shapes, you know, vocabulary, all those things are met, you know, even when you're working with math. So in other words, everything becomes integrated if you are truly working at a STEM model. I want to talk specifically now about what the brain likes. In other words, how do we incorporate body, mind, and brain? Because the brain is really where we're storing the information, or we're storing the information. And so when we think about the brain as this organ that is the body is helping to bring in the stimuli, the mind is helping us to decide what we are going to bring in, and then the brain is actually that storage device that we have. You know, discovery is one of the key pieces here. The brain likes discovery and divergent learning. Well, I already talked about science as being outside. What a great thing to do is go discover what's outside. The brain likes that. So you go outside, you discover a bird's nest. You know, okay, so you can talk about what type of bird. Here we get into the science, the life sciences again. You know, what type of bird. We look at the eggs. We look at the shape of the nest, and we do a little bit of research. This is where our electronic media comes in. We can do some research there. Or we look at books, you know, or we find a person who can help us, a more knowledgeable, maybe an ornithologist, or we check in with someone at a university or something, someplace that would be able to provide us with some information. Anyway, so there's discovery, the questions that children have based on that. What kind of bird was it? Then we take a look at the shape of the egg. We talk about the color of the egg. The construction of the nest is an engineering piece that we talk about. The materials that were used in order to construct the nest. And then we talk about divergent learning. Divergent learning is when we look at something or we experience something and we see it in different ways. And so we look at the image that I put up here, and yes, it's a nest with eggs in it, but also the other things I talked about, guess what? It's divergent learning. We can talk about the shape of the nest. That's divergent learning. That's looking at things from a different perspective. We can talk about how many eggs are there. That's different. The shade of color of the eggs, the materials that the nest was made out of. All this is divergent learning. It's looking at something. It's not just a nest any longer. It's a house. It's a repository. It has shape. It has form. It's constructed of different things. That's all about divergent learning and looking at something and sort of webbing off of that to mean so many other things. The brain also likes high challenge and low threat. You're going to be seeing a couple images here that you're going to go, whoa, why did you put that up there? I'm not necessarily advocating for certain things. I'm just using them as illustrations for what I'm trying to convey. I am not promoting children standing on a bed trying to hula hoop and possibly fall off. However, I like this image because it's showing high challenge. This is a challenge. Think of the unevenness of the mattress and the child having to determine weight distribution. There's that vestibular and proprioceptive sense coming in loud and clear here. Weight distribution, the use of body parts, proprioceptive stuff going on all over the place here. The child is using the hula hoop. There's a sense of gravity. There's some science concepts being applied here. There's high challenge. In other words, the child keeping the hula hoop up, that's a high challenge, but there is low threat. The child does not look flustered at all. The child looks like, hey, this is all fine and good. Now, we as adults look at this in somewhat a little horror, thinking, well, the child could fall off, hit her head on the side table, something could happen, the lamp could get broken. I mean, we look at all the other stuff, and yet the child recognizes this as an opportunity. It's high challenge and low threat. That's why all of us don't do skydiving. We don't all necessarily go skiing. So on, we look at challenges and threats as being so different. But the brain likes high challenge, low threat, and that's an optimal learning methodology. The brain also likes novelty, doing things, experiencing things in a novel capacity. And so when we provide experience to children that are quote unquote non-traditional or are doing it in a different way, it's like when I learned, I've had the good fortune of traveling to Reggio Emilia over in Italy. And the thing I learned in Reggio was this notion of this idea that presenting materials that you wouldn't typically always use. And so instead of just having the children write with pencils or whatever, I had a whole bunch of different things that children could write with. They could write with chalk. They could write with crayons. They could write with a couple different kinds of markers. They could write with colored pencils or regular pencils, pens, uniball pens, and so on. In other words, the options, novelty, and the children liked that. In other words, I learned early on that children, responded well to novel methodologies of figuring out things. And then when I expanded that into letting the kids use clay to roll out clay and to form letters, or to use rubber stamps and to stamp letters and that sort of thing. Begin looking at writing their names and experiencing text and print in a variety of ways, painting it, using bodies to form the letters and so on. In other words, it becomes this internalized way of dealing with information, and the brain likes that. And so you can hear there's also the body is incorporating that, as well as the mind. In other words, what children are going to find fun and enjoy at the same time. The brain also works best in a social situation when we are talking, communicating, interacting with each other. There's what I refer to as a synergistic effect. If you don't know what synergism is when the two ideas come together, or two people come together with ideas, and the solution that happens is greater than what either one were able to do individually. And so our brains like social situations. We like brainstorming. That's why brainstorming is so powerful. It's because I have ideas, you have ideas. And my ideas are great, your ideas are great, but when we put both of them together, we come up with solutions and things that neither one of us necessarily would have thought about individually. And so the brain likes this, and when we put and allow children to have this kind of input with each other, the whole lot of learning is going to occur. Manipulatives, a very, very important piece for us to remember. Our fingertips have more neural connections into our brains than any other part of our body, including our hearts. I'll repeat that. There are more neural connections, brain connections from our fingertips into our brains than any other part of our body, including our hearts. And that's why hands-on, tactile, object manipulative related experiences are so critical. It's also why we have to be cautious with just using screens as a teaching or an information delivery system. It's one thing to look at the images that are on the screen here, but it's another thing to actually interact with each of those objects. And so we need to take that into consideration. Probably one of the best things I can say to sort of put all that together is there's a book written by Lisa Elliott from the University of Chicago several years ago called Pink Brain, Blue Brain. And in that book, Lisa talks about, there's a difference between an image on a screen of a pitcher with water and being able to manipulate that image to show the pitcher emptying the water. There's a big difference between that experience and actually holding a pitcher full of water and dumping that water or pouring that water into glasses or some other receptacle. In other words, manipulatives are such a vital piece of the learning process. And I hope that if you are doing any kind of virtual instruction, that you're also encouraging children to actually have manipulatives with them while they are actually doing that. It's very, very brain friendly type of thing to consider. Our brains are very much used to asking questions. Our brains are pattern seeking. Note that our brains are pattern seeking organs. We are looking for patterns. And when, but back to that idea of novelty and discovery and divergency, we like the base pattern, but then we like to build upon that. And we like to go in a whole bunch of different directions. That's where the high challenge, low threat comes in as well. I use this image because I think of it, children asking questions. Children have lots of questions. And if we allow them to ask those questions, it's going to be much more satisfying for them rather than us asking them all the time. back to what I basically started with earlier. Here's a child. What kind of questions does the child have? What's at the end of the road? What's out there? Why are there yellow lines on the road? Why is my shadow at an angle? Why is my hair blowing? Why does the sky touch the ground? What is that out there on the horizon? The child has all these questions. And if we allow the child to ask us those questions, we're going to be addressing the child's needs. That's what the child's interested in. It's not us instructing the child and saying, well, let's look at the green grass and the blue sky. No, in fact, why are we even using those plain words? Why don't we use words like, oh, some of the grass looks like it's a lime color, or some of the grass looks like it's a pine color. The sky looks light blue. It's an azure colored sky. In other words, using vocabulary is so important too. In conjunction with inquiry, it's okay if children ask us questions that we don't know the answer to. In other words, why does the sky touch the ground? That may seem like an esoteric thing, and we as adults sort of have a comprehension of what that means. But trying to explain that to a child, is difficult. But it's okay if we don't know answers. Alison Gopnik, some of you may know who Alison Gopnik is. She wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Gardener and the Carpenter. I was getting mixed up. It's either The Gardener and the Carpenter or The Carpenter and the Gardener. It's the title of the book. But Alison talks about in that book about her grandchild. And she talks about that in a learning environment, that we as educators, as teachers, as parents, as grandparents, and so on, it's okay for us to say, I wonder, or what if, or I wonder how. We're giving that substantial, ability for children to understand it's okay to have questions. And if we link it back to STEM and SEAM, what are questions? Questions are are probably based on hypotheses. And so we're actually starting a science linked orientation. It's science in practice. In other words, we're laying down hypotheticals and so on. And we can tell children, well, we're going to research that. We're going to go find out, so it's okay for us to say, I don't know, or let's go find out. Those are all kinds of things. So children have questions, we should have questions, and we don't have to know all the answers. That's perfect. Language modeling is absolutely critical in a body, brain, mind piece, because language is what helps us to grasp concepts. Now, when I say language, yes, I'm basically talking about verbal communication, but at the same time, language can also be, nonverbal communication. I'm using my hands. I can see my hands in my little box here. So I'm using, body language to help, enforce what I'm saying. I see my head turn, my eyebrows go certain directions, I tilt my head. So there's all kinds of body language going on too. But language modeling is absolutely critical in the body, brain, mind teaching and learning concept. The more words we know and understand, the more we're going to grasp conceptual ideas. In other words, we're going to build that cognitive development. So that's why talking to children while they are involved in play is building on their vocabulary. There's a couple sound reasons also why language modeling in a school situation or an academic situation is so critical. We'll give you just two of those because they relate directly to you and children who are going to be leaving you from preschool and going to kindergarten. We know that the size of a child's vocabulary going into kindergarten. Now that, in other words, this is basically 5-year-olds, children going into kindergarten. There's a direct correlation between the size of their vocabulary and their academic success. In other words, the more words a child can express or has receptive language. In other words, some children and people just aren't as talkative. They aren't as verbose. They just don't use as many words. And that's fine. That's fine. People can communicate in a variety of ways. I said language modeling, it's really about communication. Maybe children draw what they're thinking. Maybe children dance out what they're thinking. We borrow from the old stuff from Howard Gardner and multiple intelligences and some of the other things too. Communication takes on so many different, there's so many different methods we can do that. Dance, construction, artistic expression, and that sort of thing. So, but the more words or the more language and communication skills that a child possesses going into kindergarten is a great indicator of their academic success. The second point related to that is the greater the vocabulary is of a child, the greater likelihood they also are going to have self-regulation and self-control. In other words, there's better behavior or appropriate behaviors, the more words that a child knows and is able to internalize as well as communicate. So language modeling, we want to talk lots to children, especially preschool. We want to talk lots. Hopefully as babies and toddlers and twos, they've been talked to, sung to, read to, all through those years, and that language has been, a foundation has been laid. And by the time they come to you as in preschool, you're enhancing that. And so you're providing even more. And that's why talking to and with them is such a critical piece. The environment itself has to be appealing and stimulating. From a body, brain, mind piece, we know that the environment influences us. Colors in our environment are critical. They're psychologically impactful as well as behaviorally. We know too much red, too much bright yellow in a classroom are going to elicit aggression and hunger. We know that blues, greens, and browns in a classroom are going to elicit lots more calming behaviors. At the same time, we want environments to be appealing and stimulating at the same time. Ample resources, exciting resources, the ability to interact with those resources is such a critical piece. Also, we need to understand that what we are striving for is resiliency in children. If children are resilient, they're going to be successful. In other words, we are laying down a lot of brain pieces, body pieces, mind pieces that are going to instill this sense that school learning or classrooms are a fun place to be. And as a result of that, children are going to be able to accomplish a lot. Now, once again, I told you, some of my images might be a little controversial. I'm not advocating that children drink out of water hoses. Please do not take this image as that. I use it just though because look at the resiliency of this child and her success. She had a need, a severe need. She was thirsty. She was very, very thirsty. She's hot. She's sweaty. She needs something, and she recognizes that the water hose provided that. Now, at the same time, I would hope that we would find better resources for her, and that she could find a water fountain or some other source of water. But she was very successful, and the brain likes having options. Discovery divergent learning. Think about that. She knows that water comes out of the hose, but her divergent learning says water comes out of a faucet. Water comes out of a spigot, that sort of thing. So there's all kinds of how all these things sort of work together. So if we think about putting all this together, I want to think about that the body, brain, and mind are intertwined. In other words, one does not, they don't, those three pieces do not necessarily work independently. The body is, bringing information in, the sensory stimuli come in, the brain is storing that information, but the choices and decisions that guide what the body is going to take in come from our minds. And so as teachers, we need to learn what is pleasant for children, what excites children, what helps children to be, good thinkers and so on. Questions, I'll allude to that in a moment, give you an option for that. But if you've seen me present before, I often use this quote from Lawrence Nalaguzzi, one of the founders of the Reggio Emilia schools. Nothing without joy. And this, over the years, has become such a internalized piece for me that if I'm not happy when I'm working with children, the children can't be happy. And the children aren't happy, I can't be happy. And so I need to think about everything that I'm doing, keeping that joyful environment, because I know from a body, brain, mind connection that if it goes back to that idea of play, whenever something is positive and exciting and joyful, the brain is picking up on the information that surrounds that. And so actually we are enhancing everything that a child can possibly learn. As far as questions, we don't have time or opportunity in this particular venue to do that. But I want to provide you with my personal contact information. You'll see my cell phone number, my personal email, as well as my business email. You are more than welcome to be in touch with me. You can text me even on my cell phone. You're more than welcome to be in touch with me if you have questions, if you are looking for resources, if you want data, if you want to know more about sciences and so on. I'm happy to present that information. I try to keep up with some of the research on things. My interest in the last few years, as I indicated earlier, have been a lot about mental health and learning, and especially as we're dealing with the pandemic, and on the other side of that, and in our society and so on, looking at trauma and the how trauma is impacting things and how that's going to impact us in our field especially. And as someone who continues to do things virtually, but probably will be back on the road within the next few months doing a lot of trainings, I think we need to come to grips with that trauma is definitely going to be impacting how children learn, as well as how we are going to have to instruct and how we're going to have to be with families and so on. So I want to thank you all very, very much for your participation today. I hope it's been a learning experience for you. I hope you picked up on some things. Maybe it's just been reinforcing some of the things that you already knew. But I want to thank you all very, very much.